thanks everyone for coming. This is a Vector Distinguished lecture, and if you don't know, the Vector Distinguished Lecture Series is a gathering of academic and industrial scientists across the Toronto area and inviting people from outside to discuss advanced topics in machine learning and to help foster our wonderful machine learning community here. And today, I'm very excited that we have Anima Anandkumar here to give us a talk. For those who don't know, Anima is a professor at Caltech and has done a lot of amazing work over the years on some people might know about Mind Dojo, this wonderful Minecraft playing agent that won a NeurIPS Best Paper Award, tensor decompositions from back in the day, SciSGD, the list goes on and on. These days, Anima has been working on kind of AI plus science and Gen AI plus science, lots of interesting stuff, and that's what she'll be talking to us about today. So without further ado, I'll let her take over and start the talk.
Thank you, Colin, and it's great to be here virtually, and hopefully one day I'll also get to visit. And great that you're having this series. And in fact, just as we speak, one collaborative project between University of Toronto and my team, they're presenting today at ICLR, so on low precision neural operators. But yeah, that's hopefully we'll have even more collaborations after this talk and beyond. Yeah, so broadly, like Colin said, I'm excited about how we can bring the advances of AI and especially generative AI now to scientific domains. There is the aspect of taking existing techniques like transformers and using that on other kinds of data, and we'll see already some very exciting results as as part of that. But there's also the question of like, how do we think about processes that are not directly amenable to transformers or existing AI methods, as well as other challenges like what about when data is limited, and what about incorporating the domain knowledge and constraints in the right way to enable extrapolation, especially when we are thinking about scientific inventions and discoveries that is by nature extrapolation. So there's a lot of like general AI techniques that can feed into science, but there's also more to be done in terms of algorithmic development to specifically tackle issues that are very central to these scientific problems. And that's where I think there is a great opportunity. And this is something I've been doing for several years now. We started the AI and Science Initiative at Caltech in 2018. Very early days back then when there wasn't a lot of like, let's say, the importance of what AI could do to a lot of scientific domains. But now we are in a place where it's very clear that this is the future. And indeed, just to kind of set the stage, the aspect of what makes generative AI in particular very exciting for scientific domains is the aspect that you broadly encode the distribution, right? So meaning that ability to generate high-dimensional candidates given some low-dimensional specifications, like in the case of, let's say, a drug molecule, you want properties of the molecule in terms of, let's say, it shouldn't be toxic, it should bind to certain proteins. You can specify that, and then you come up with the generation of the said molecule given those specifications. And for a long time, we thought this is very hard. That's why a lot of research over the previous decade was on discriminative AI, where we are given the input and we want to just come up with a categorization that is low dimensional. So this inverse process we thought would require a lot more data and compute than what was actually needed to solve many of these problems. And I do think that's because there is nice structure. We've seen that with natural language and images and even videos, but I also think even in scientific domains, problems that are currently hard, either in a computational sense or in the sense of needing a lot of experimentation in the physical world to get to answers, there's still a lot of nice structure, and there's a lot of this Occam's razor that simple solutions are the ones that tend to work well. So given that, I think they're very amenable to broadly thinking of it in terms of generative AI. And what are some benefits we've seen so far? Indeed, when we are thinking of language model paradigm of predicting the next word and learning on a large corpus, that has worked very well with text models. And now you can ask, how can I apply to scientific domains? And there's been a ton of work looking at just text data itself in terms of scientific literature and trying to come up with, right, either like a search, like searching for scientific facts, or some high-level specifications of certain designs like molecules. But the challenge is there is a lot more data that is not encoded as text, right? So the text is only high level. If you want to look at the actual natural processes, you need to get data that is beyond just text. And that you will see is the general theme of what I'm talking here, how we can go beyond just text data. I mean, one natural avenue that is text-like, meaning it's discrete tokens, but it's a different kind of data, is looking at genome sequences. So this is work we did about 2 years ago, where we were now asking, instead of text models, we can use the same transformer and all of those frameworks, but now train it on data of nucleotides. And again, here, scale matters, right? So instead of just looking at genome sequences of one species, what if we did this on all of genomes available? And it turns out that if you look at genomes of humans, or even especially plants which have multiple copies, that is enormous, right? So we are talking about sequences in the millions of length. And to begin with, we wanted to come up with the first model that looks at only bacterial and viral genomes. And the reason is, first of all, we have a biobank of like these genomes that are about 110 million sequences. So it's a large number. Second of all, it's important because it encodes the mutations. So you have viral and bacterial evolution, and those are recorded in the changes of these genome sequence. And so taking that and understanding how these evolutionary dynamics happen, right? So can we predict how virus and bacteria mutate? And not only that, there's a lot of genes in virus and bacteria that are shared with higher organisms, including humans. So by understanding gene level functional relationships, we can further use that to design proteins that are also relevant to us, relevant to us in terms of better enzymes, better cures. So you have that benefit just by looking at viral and bacterial genome. And that's what we did. We built the largest biological model at that time, about 25 billion parameter model. I mean, quite small compared to language models, but that model was able to come up with now insights in terms of how do these viruses mutate. So we fine-tuned this on coronavirus. And during training, we only showed it the alpha and beta variants. And it turns out that it was able to predict successfully all the variants that emerged later, including Delta, Omicron, I think the BQ.11. So it's able to successfully predict how the evolutionary dynamics proceeds. And that's very useful as we keep track of pandemics, as well as keep track of what mutations are concerning. So in order to make that reasoning in terms of new mutations that have not yet appeared and how we want to reason about it, we need to go beyond just the genome sequence, right? So the genome sequence tells you there's a new mutation. But what is the impact of this new mutation? For that, we need to go to the level of interactions. So in blue is the spike protein, and the changes being shown are the new mutations that are proposed by this generative model. But we need to understand how these new mutations change the binding mechanism with proteins in our body. So like the one in orange. And so in order to do this, to study these kind of dynamics, it's no longer just discrete data, right? So we're no longer just looking at sequence data. We are now asking, first of all, it's three-dimensional. You're looking at the structure of these proteins, but it's not just the structure, it's also the dynamics. How do they interact and how do they change their behavior during this interaction? And that directly has an impact in deciding if these mutations are concerning, because if there's strong binding, then that is a more concerning mutation. And so now the question is, how do we learn models that can predict these kinds of variety of different interactions under different conditions? And there, we don't have a lot of experimental data, right? We have very limited experimental data in terms of dynamics, but we have mathematical equations. We have partial differential equations, both at the level of Newtonian mechanics. So how do these, different bonds change, and how does the conformations change for the proteins? But you could also go at the quantum level and ask, what is the wave function interaction? And we can solve that through Schrodinger's equation, which is a partial differential equation. So in principle, we have like equations that specify how these interactions happen. And that's true for a lot of processes we see in nature. So you can go from such atomic and molecular scale dynamics to even planetary scale dynamics, such as what we see with weather and how we can predict and forecast the weather over the not only next few days. You could also ask about climate under changing carbon dioxide in terms of climate change and inferring that over the next decades. So there is a wide span of both spatial and temporal scales that are needed to that need to be incorporated in order to study, reason, simulate, and understand these processes. And that's where, it's a whole new game in terms of how to learn and be able to efficiently capture these different scales. So that's the main difference, I would say, from traditional computer vision. So if you're looking at computer vision, you're mostly doing a lot of processing to make it visually appealing, right? So a generative model generating faces or anything else, it just has to look visually good. It doesn't need to go back to the real world, and you don't need to, if you try to 3D print a drone that is proposed by DALI or one of those models, it won't have the physical validity. But that's not true for the simulations of this kind, whether it's at the molecular scale or at the planetary scale. We need to capture the right details, and we need to be able to predict accurately how those fine details affect the macroscopic behavior. And that's the main challenge with traditional simulations, right? So even without AI, we have simulations both at the molecular level as well as at the planetary level. So here's an example I'm showing of how there are different phenomena that occur at different physical scales or different resolutions that unless you go to that fine scale, you're not capturing that information. And to and this is where traditional simulations become very expensive, right? So for instance, this is like information from my colleague Tapio Schneider's work on climate models, where the approximation is something like 100 billion times more computing than what we have today in order to accurately model these fine scale clouds, in order to be able to what they call resolve these fine scales in order to accurately predict what will be the cloud cover, what will be the cloud movement, and how does that change with changing carbon dioxide. And that's a big challenge today. So this is so out of bounds with traditional simulations in terms of compute needs. And that's also true in this case of, like, if you look at molecular level dynamics, and in many cases, you do need to incorporate the quantum effects, because at the scales we're talking about, right, you have like quantum effects. But to do that, if you brute force try to solve Schrodinger's equation, that would be about taking more than the age of the universe to solve that equation, even for just 100 atom system. And we are talking about systems that can be much bigger, that can still incorporate these effects. And that remains a big problem today, that, compared to, say, natural language, where you don't have a lot of mathematical equations or structure, where the bitter lesson holds, because you throw away more of the structure, and there is all the data of the internet, and you learn over that. The contrast here is, first of all, we may have very limited or no data in many cases, right? But we have mathematical specifications. But you cannot solve those equations because that's way too expensive. And so traditionally, there have been a lot of approximations made to make these computations reasonable, right? But the question is, can machine learning help come up with new approximations or new shortcuts and be able to solve these equations much faster, and also potentially much better, when it takes in observational data and removes modeling errors in a way that's not possible with rigid numerical methods that don't adapt to data. So this is where I see the benefits of thinking about machine learning approaches in contrast to traditional simulations for many of these domains. But I again want to emphasize, if you did a standard computer vision model here, right, you can take a transformer, you can patch at a certain resolution. So where the resolution at which you decide to patch matters, because then it's determining at which scale are you measuring the system. And a lot of the current computer vision architectures, the goal is to filter out those fine details, because that's really works well with visual appeal, and also for segmentation and these kind of processes that are all about filtering out the fine details. But for many of these physical systems, fine details matter a lot, right? So you need to be able to incorporate that in your predictions in a very nuanced way. And that's where we also need to be more thoughtful. So, this is where we came up with this idea of neural operators as extending neural networks to now be able to handle any resolution. So I want to emphasize the part about extending neural networks. So we are not talking about competing with the current neural network architectures, right? So you can take any current neural network architecture, but make it into this neural operator where we look at now representation as a continuous function rather than a fixed set of pixels. So what you see here on the left is the representation at a finer resolution than one that has a limited set of pixels. So if you're limited to a fixed resolution, you zoom in, it gets blurry, you don't capture the details. On the other hand, if you represent now the output of your neural architecture as a function that you can query at any resolution, you can keep refining it and you can capture the fine details. And that's what neural operators are doing. So I also like the analogy of vector graphics versus raster. So if you're a graphics person, or you're aware of this, the raster graphics is like the right side, right? It's like fixed pixels. You zoom in, it gets blurry. The left side is vector graphics, representing the graphics as shapes where you can keep zooming into any resolution and it's still sharp. And the analogy is the same here with neural operators. We allow this ability to keep zooming into any resolution. Of course, now the question is, how do you represent these functions? And the key new aspect is, unlike raster graphics where you parameterize the shapes beforehand, here we are learning that from data, right? So that's what makes it expressive and fitting it to the data at hand while also capturing the fine details. And so this is just a quick note here showing how we can now do prediction at a higher resolution than the training data for this fluid dynamics experiment. So our model is taking the initial conditions of the fluid dynamics and predicting the trajectory of how that is going to evolve. And you can see that also on the right, that aspect of importance of fine scales, because the energy at different wave numbers or different scales is changing as a function, right? That's expected. And there is a decay, so the fine scales have lower energy than the coarse scales. But the aspect is there's interaction between all these scales that is critical. So the fine scales affect the overall coarse scale behavior, which is why it's important to incorporate that effect correctly. And if trained on limited resolution, that's where you see my cursor, the model only sees what is the energy at these limited scales, right? It has no idea of what should be the plot looking like, what the curve looks like on the right, because it's never seen that before. And that's what happens if you took a unit, for instance, the red line here. You can predict reasonably well in the training regime. You have enough data, you fit to this distribution. That's not a surprise. But on the other hand, you want to extend it beyond or extrapolate it to do super resolution. So this is zero-shot super resolution where we are asking it to make these predictions beyond the resolution it has seen during training. And for that, we add an interpolation on top, because UNet is always limited to one resolution. But you can say, now I'm going to do like bilinear interpolation or so, and I can come up with predictions on new points that are not available during training. And if you do that, it will result in severe distortion. So that's because the model isn't kind of like trying to predict what happens in between the grid points, right? It only tries to get right what happens at the grid points. And now if you do a basic interpolation to try to predict what happens in between the grid points, that tends to be very wrong. And this is where our neural operators shine, because you can see that it has, first of all, the blue line where even though it's trained on data of limited resolution, it gracefully extrapolates to higher resolution. In a way, it's building in this inductive bias of like, oh, there should be this drop off of energy by looking at nearby points. It's able to predict now what happens in these intermediate grid points that were not seen during training. On the other hand, you can further improve this benefits of neural operators by adding in the physics. So fundamentally, there'll be a gap between the ground truth and the blue line, which is only a data-driven model, because you see limited resolution. Whereas the green line, which combines both data and physics, is right on top of the ground truth. So you don't see the ground truth because the green and the dotted line are right on top of each other. And so what does this mean? So what intuitively is happening is you're learning from data at the coarse resolution, right? The behavior of what happens at these coarse scales, but also extrapolating it to the fine scales. But now you can use the knowledge of physics. The knowledge, this is a Navier-Stokes equation. It should satisfy this equation. So you can add that as a loss function. And then by adding that at a finer resolution, you're using the knowledge of physics to fill in the fine details. So roughly what's happening is data at a coarse resolution, physics at a fine resolution. Both are distilled into one model, right? Both are distilled seamlessly. And that's why you're getting the overall full frequency versus energy plot to be accurate. And so we are capturing the fine scales, and this becomes important in a number of settings as you're taking these flows, especially flows in the turbulent regime, and you want to roll it out and predict how that is going to evolve. So you need the information of the fine scales, and that's what these models are able to do. So let me give a few applications of what we've done before going into the details of neural operator. So we built ForecastNet. That was the first fully AI-based weather model. So tens of thousands of times faster than traditional weather models. So just to tell you a little bit of history, we started working on this more than 3 years ago. And there was a lot of skepticism of what AI can do for weather forecasting that has seen decades of innovation, right? Decades of development. And traditional weather models solve partial differential equations in a bottom-up manner. So try to model very carefully all of the physics that is known and try to calibrate just a few parameters of those PDE based on all the data that's available, the historical weather data. And then here we are, we had done simple variants, we had developed neural operators, or we had looked at its benefits for fluid dynamics, and we wanted to come up with a much more challenging domain, right? So we wanted to show that this works in a much more challenging domain. And that's what we did by looking at the weather scenario where there is historical weather data that goes back to 4 decades, but barely any of that was getting used uh, to learn from all that data. And so we took that data and then we said, okay, what if AI were to completely replace the forecasting, right? So given the initial conditions, now I have a fully AI-based model that predicts what's going to happen to the weather in the next 2 weeks. So 1 to 2 weeks is the predictability range, and we wanted to come up with predictions there. And so and then to our surprise, that these model, the ForecastNet was pretty accurate, close to the traditional weather models while being tens of thousands of times faster. And it not only predicted typical weather conditions, like being here in California and it's sunny, a lot of models can do well, right? But it's not just the typical weather, but also extreme weather events. So here I showed like atmospheric rivers that have an impact on whether there's storms or droughts here in California, hurricanes, typhoons, all of these events that are rarer. So you have less data, even those this model it was able to pick up pretty well. And that's the aspect I think that surprised a lot of people. In fact, our models are running in ECMWF. So if you look at ECMWF charts, there's something you can go and check out now. So it's been running since last September. And in fact, it predicted Hurricane Lee last year, even many days earlier, about 4 days earlier compared to traditional weather models. So it's showing benefits not only with speed, but also accuracy. And now as we continue to train these models on full data, in fact, we hadn't even used the full data available of historical weather, but as we continue to do that, I think we'll see even more benefits of being able to adapt to data and at the same time capture the complexity of these physical systems. So there's another benefit the speed of these AI-based models provide, which is the ability to create much larger ensembles for these extreme weather events. So events like hurricanes, you want to be able to create different perturbations and look at the uncertainty, right? Because the uncertainty or the risk assessment is what informs policies like, oh, should there be an evacuation? Now, that has a direct impact on human lives, economic costs. So you shouldn't just look at deterministic forecast. You want to look at entire systems of ensemble. And to do that well is challenging for the current weather models because it's so expensive. It takes big supercomputers, CPU-based supercomputers to run them. And you barely have about 50 such perturbations. So we know there's no statistical concentration if you just take 50 samples, right? And that's a limitation of the current systems, whereas with AI-based weather models, we can now have these huge ensembles and be able to come up with accurate risk assessment. So it's not only for weather modeling, we've also used this for replacing PD solvers in a range of scenarios. This was carbon capture and storage, where we are looking at a multi-phase flow system. What is the pressure buildup? How does carbon dioxide move over several decades if you were to pump this underground? So, checking the feasibility of carbon dioxide storage at scale on multiple wells and doing high resolution simulations, we see our model is like 700,000 times faster than traditional models. And this has been in a number of other scenarios, from material deformation. We're looking at plasma evolution in fusion and how to predict disruptions in real time before they occur, as well as problems like ultrasound, where it's an inverse problem. So you're doing reconstruction based on how the acoustic waves bounce off and trying to image lungs or other parts of the body. And in all of this, we see big speed ups compared to traditional solvers and traditional systems. And as I mentioned, it's not just about forward simulation. You can also do this for inverse problems. So there are two examples I want to showcase here. One is a medical catheter where the goal was to reduce bacterial contamination. I'm not sure how many of you are aware that there is a high incidence of infection. In fact, the leading cause of healthcare-related infection with the use of catheters. That's because the bacteria tend to swim upstream in a smooth tube because there's less friction. So the idea our collaborators came up with was to add ridges, right? These are not in a standard catheter, but the goal was to 3D print these small ridges so that you not only kind of make it harder to swim along the wall for the bacteria, more importantly, it can cause vortices, right? So when there are vortices, it becomes harder for the bacteria to swim upstream. So we 3D printed what AI designed. So we taught this neural operator model, it learned over different geometric designs. And then we could invert the problem and ask it to optimize for the design of the catheter. This is because AI models are differentiable. You get this for free. You can directly do inverse optimization. And that's what we did. We came up with a proposal of the design, and then we 3D printed it only once to test in the lab. This is the, under the microscope, what you're seeing in terms of how the bacteria are moving. And what you can see is the bacteria are getting pushed along the fluid flow, right? They're getting pushed out of the human body. And, barely you can see one or two here trying to swim upstream, but not being very successful. In fact, we measured the reduction in bacterial contamination to be 100-fold. So a big reduction in contamination because of the optimized design that these AI models were able to do. And similarly, you can think of also inverse design in a number of other scenarios, like optimizing mask design for lithography, which is an inverse problem. So now what we're doing is expanding these models that are trained on narrow domains to also learn across multiple domains, like being able to learn now different partial differential equations in one model. And we now have a paper that was recently accepted at ICML that's able to handle these very different looking data, both irregular and regular grids, right? Three-dimensional data, long trajectories, and do this on, somewhat the analogy is a GPT-2 sized model, so about 500 million parameter model, a little less than GPT-2. But you can see now the model is able to not just learn to solve one partial differential equation, but a range of different ones. So I can go a little bit more into the details of neural operators, but I can also stop here for a minute and see if there are some immediate questions, quick questions about what I presented, and see the chat as well.
I see a hand up. I think since there's just one hand up, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask that, that's fine. You could, yeah, we can also take a bunch of questions at the end too, if people don't get to ask things now.
I'm not sure if you'll be covering this, but what's your take on the SORA kind of models where they're learning some sort of physics from videos, and are you able to use such information for your physics-based models?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the SORA is similar to what our models are doing in learning trajectories, right? So we are also doing four-dimensional modeling in some of the data with fluid flow, for instance. But like in SORA, the physics is by accident. The focus is on like visual appeal, and you get some of the physics, but you also see it soon becoming wrong. And this is also true for like graphics rendering, where if you look at the fluid, it kind of like passes for something that your eye thinks is okay, but it's practically useless to actually simulate fluid dynamics to say design an aircraft wing or something else, right? So that's the difference. Like we are training on data that has the right finer scales that you can go to the physical world and have some confidence that what you've designed with this works. But in terms of at the high level, like doing 4D modeling, right, that's the common aspect. But the architectural details where, in the SORA case, you want to filter out the fine details, you just fix a resolution, whereas here we capture the fine details. That's where the difference lies. Yeah. I think there was one more hand, Omid.
Hello, and thanks a million for this wonderful presentation so far. The question which I have is that at the beginning of the session, you mentioned about the molecular dynamics and the challenges which is imposed if it's for example, the dynamics is going to be captured by the equations, for example, the Schrödinger equations, which captures at the smaller scales. These kind of, I should say, physics inspired, I should say, the neural operators, can they be used essentially in drug design when you just need to predict the conformational structures of the receptors, which is almost impossible to figure out without classical simulation techniques in order to make an interaction with the exogenous molecular drugs?
Yeah, absolutely. We have some work and some that, I'm not involved in. There are others using these both neural operator techniques or broadly like, right, neural ODE techniques, which look at both at the, right, like at the level of like how you can replace DFT and other quantum calculations with these neural operator models, but also at the molecular dynamics level. So yeah, certainly there are many works now looking at machine learning based models.
Awesome. I was wondering if, as a kind of a reference, if you can kindly, at the end of this session, if you can share some kind of external resources with respect to that, if you can remember, I really appreciate it. Then if it happens at the end of the session.
Yeah, I mean, you can also go look at my website. There's some recent work there.
Of course. I'm glad. Thanks a million. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah. I think there was one question online about how is this like doing it for, are we training the model for each case of flow, or can it do predictions? So to clarify, like what I showed earlier, you take different random set of initial conditions during training, right? And you look at how learning to predict the trajectory. And now at test time, it's a completely new condition, the initial condition for the flow. So in that sense, there is, right, it's not just fitting to the existing data like what the nerve does, in the standard neural radiance field. It's one scene, it's fixed, so it's really not learning, it's more function fitting. Whereas here there is learning. You are now seeing at test time new conditions that weren't seen during training. And not just that, new resolutions that you didn't see during training. So I think the other question was, so I will now go into the structure of like what the neural operator exactly is. So you'll see that next. And the data hungry and those I can like also address there. And yeah, so the other question of like attention-based, I'll also show some examples and how you can think of like Fourier framework as a way to make attention efficient and linear instead of quadratic. So this is a form of attention is kind of the interpretation, but you can also do full attention, but that's usually not that efficient for many of the cases we have because the data is limited. For the physics-informed neural operator, the question is, do we need labeled data? It's flexible. So in the physics-informed neural operator, we have a loss function that corresponds to checking if the partial differential equation is satisfied or not. And there's another loss function corresponding to data, right? So fitting to data. Of course, if there's no data, you can try and fit it to just like the loss function of a partial differential equation. But it turns out to be a difficult optimization landscape, especially for time-varying partial differential equations. And that's something we've never solved with deep learning, right? Optimization is still an unsolved problem. We've just gotten around to it by having more data and bigger models. But if you now have no data and you try to solve for equations that are quite difficult, the optimization gets stuck, and that's still a hard problem. And that's why we do this mix of data and some physics to get this to be practically possible. Great. So I think we got through a lot of the questions. So if there is nothing more, I can proceed. Just checking for a second if. Great. So now looking at how we can design neural operators, right? Because so far I've been like saying, oh, this is great, but what is it exactly? And that's what we'll delve into now. And as I mentioned, it's really about this neural operators is going from neural networks that are in fixed resolution or fixed input and output dimension to one where the input and output dimensions are flexible. So you can discretize or sample the input and output at any resolution after training the model, and it gives the prediction. So to give like an intuition of what is happening here, so let's look at, think of this as maybe time series, right? The input blue dots are one time series, the output orange dots are another time series. And you're trying to learn, given an input, what is the output? And so you can do that with a standard neural net. You can do that with a transformer, right? These are at fixed time points. You have the input and output. You can learn this mapping. On the other hand, what neural operators do that is different is model the input and output as continuous functions. And now you're learning the mapping between this continuous input and continuous output, rather than only at fixed grid points. And once you've learned this mapping, what you can now do is directly super resolution, right? So you can now query points that are not on the grid, that are anywhere, and you still get an answer. And so this is where what I showed with this simple toy example is to make these curves just be using like Fourier transform. So you can look at interpolation between grid points using Fourier transform, right? That way you can extend this to not just discrete points, but to continuous function. And indeed, that's where a lot of classical work has gone into using Fourier as the basis to represent continuous functions. And you could learn through this Fourier basis, this kind of mapping, and be able to query at any resolution. But of course, we know a lot of real world signals aren't that good with just a fixed basis like Fourier transform. You're better off learning that from data and coming up with more efficient basis. That's entirely what has happened with computer vision, right? Earlier, there were all these hand-engineered fixed bases. And with neural net, we just learned it from data and it was better. But we can do the same philosophy here of learning it from data. And that's where we are now going to come up with ways to learn the right feature transformation to solve, let's say, partial differential equations or other examples where the input and output are functions. So we're learning this mapping between function spaces. So just to kind of say what an operator is this mapping between function spaces. And that's why we have the term neural operator. And so what you're learning as this mapping is, for instance, let's take the simple example of linear partial differential equation. So if, right, as a simple case to begin with. So if the equation is linear, it turns out that the solution is also linear, which is not surprising. And it has a nice form as an integral transform. So the inverse of differentiation is integration. But really what this is saying is we can now represent my mapping in terms of this kernel, a kernel that learns pairwise relationship between any 2 points in the domain, and then you integrate that. And so you take the input function and you integrate with this kernel and you get the output. And equations like heat diffusion, you can represent it in this form. And the intuition is, right, depending on the heat source, you can kind of like represent how the kernel changes, right? What is this kernel as a, how it changes with the presence of the heat source and how the heat conduction is, just as a rough intuition. So now the question is, we have this known form for representing linear partial differential equations. How can we represent general partial differential equations and general mappings that are nonlinear? We can take this block and add nonlinear transformations, or say nonlinear activations like, ReLU is popular, right? For a lot of this, we use like a Gaussian error linear unit or GeLU or those variants for some smoothness reasons. But yeah, those aspects like nonlinear activations will make this model expressive. And it's the same philosophy as in a neural net. You have a linear matrix multiplication, but you have a nonlinear activation to make it expressive. And we can do the same here by now replacing matrix multiplication of fixed dimension to one that is an integral transform that can now work at any resolution. But this linear part is followed with nonlinearity to give it an expressive model. And that's how we can, in fact, show this becomes now a universal approximation in function space. So that's the broad intuition, right? But now how do we come up with practical architectures based on this? So one example is you can directly discretize this kernel integration. So meaning you can now learn this pairwise mapping of the kernel and come up with now summation instead of integration. And this is nothing but the graph neural net. So in a graph neural net, you pass messages amongst the neighbors, you aggregate information, and that's how you come up with a value at a certain node or a feature at a certain node. So this is the same thing as a graph neural net, except now what we're doing is we learn this kernel or the mapping between any 2 points in the domain, right? So it has either spatial or temporal domain, you're learning this mapping. And now you can add new points. So it need not be the graph neural net with a fixed graph, but now you're adding new points and you can form the graph based on spatial information. For instance, you could make the graph just to be a fixed radius around the point. So the intuition is you're taking the information around nearby points because they're all correlated. If you think about a heat diffusion or fluid flow, nearby points are all correlated, right? And you're trying to kind of aggregate all that information and come up with an answer. And that's what graph neural nets do. So we can take that, but we can additionally add the aspect of flexibility of adding new points and having edges based on spatial information and spatial location. And with this, we can learn solutions to partial differential equations. The one challenge, though, is if you make this graph too local, so the radius for forming the edges is too small, then it cannot capture global information, global phenomena like fluid flow, right? Like the fluid flow, even those points that are far off have an impact. So making the graph local isn't good for that expressivity. On the other hand, if you make the graph very big, right, the radius, and have all the edges, this is quadratic and this is expensive. And so if you want to avoid that cost, this is not so good. And this is where we use this Fourier framework as a way to capture global information. I mean, so in a way, like if you think about attention and this graph, right? So the graph is like local attention. If you make this now fully connected graph, that is like attention. So you can see that you can do that here, except that it's going to be very expensive, because typically we may want to do this on large number of points. And you also want the flexibility to add new points and do this at finer and finer resolution, and that becomes expensive. So yes, you can do transformers where you capture the kernel between any 2 points in the domain and do that attention, but it's just too expensive. And this is where the Fourier model is a nice, efficient way to capture global attention. And in fact, this kind of Fourier-based attention is also used in computer vision in a number of recent papers. So, it can have benefits even beyond just the partial differential equations I'm talking about. But what is the intuition here? So you can now look at learning this kind of like kernel integration, right? This kind of mapping. You treat this as a convolution, like a special cases convolution, and then you transform it into the Fourier domain. So convolution becomes multiplication in the Fourier domain. That's a signal processing 101. But roughly what's happening is by taking this to the Fourier domain, you're learning what are the weights I need to incorporate for different frequencies. And then you come back to the standard domain and you repeat this, but have nonlinearities. So if you didn't have nonlinearity, you just had these set of operations be repeated again and again. That's similar to a pseudospectral numerical solver. So there are existing numerical solvers that solve in the Fourier domain, right? But what we are now doing is adding nonlinearity. And in fact, we also have nonlinear encoders and decoders. And that's what brings in the deep learning flavor of expressivity, right? Nonlinearity is always good, or at least good for fitting to data. But now we're still keeping some of the efficiency gains because Fourier transform of FFT can be done in linear time, which is great. And you can now capture even, right, when it's a large domain. And that's the benefit. You capture those global information, global correlations very well while being efficient. And this was just the picture I was just saying earlier. If you just took the linear part of the model, that's the traditional numerical solver. But by adding all this nonlinearity, we make the model richer. It learns a better basis than what was possible with the fixed basis used by the traditional solvers. And so we're really merging these techniques together, and we're keeping this ability to query at any resolution like what standard solvers have. So there are some nice benefits to doing this in terms of, right, guarantees of how, if you keep refining the mesh or adding more points, what happens to the solution? Is there a theoretical guarantee we can provide? And that's what you saw also in the plot earlier. You can keep asking for information at finer resolution. But how good is that prediction, right? It turns out it's graceful and it converges to the limit. So that's the aspect here. Here, the input was a coarse grid. It came up with a solution, right? So the intuition is if you start with a coarse grid of points, you kind of don't have all the aspects of capturing the fine details. But as you refine the grid, you will have a more refined solution. But as you see, it's a nice convergence. So when the mesh is fine enough, you have the solution converge to a unique limit. And that's where you have the nice guarantee that there is suddenly not a big change from one resolution to another, as long as you're at a fine enough resolution in an asymptotic sense. And you also see that in empirical results as well. So I know we're coming up to the hour. I won't, like I mentioned, I gave some overview of these architectures, like graph is an example, right? The Fourier domain was the other example. for the weather model, we can also do Fourier transform on the sphere, which keeps the nice property that the world is a sphere. And that has benefits when you do long rollouts. It doesn't have much benefit if you just ask for short-term weather. But when you do long rollouts, if you treat the world as a rectangle, all the errors build up, right? And it explodes. But keeping it as a sphere keeps it contained. And this is where I emphasize again, for extrapolation is where all of these domain constraints knowledge matters, right? If you don't do extrapolation, doesn't matter. Take your standard favorite transformer, everything works. But so much of what we want to do is extrapolation, and having domain constraints is important. There's also open source library on that. I won't get into that. But also you can do like new architectures that combine both global and local information. This was our NeurIPS paper where we did this for car geometry, where aerodynamics on the car, where you want to capture the local irregular grid. Graph is great for irregular grid, but then you can transform it into a latent space with a regular grid where you can do Fourier transform. And you can also do this as a coarser resolution. So you can go from fine resolution, learn the information, get to coarse resolution, save computation, and learn end-to-end a really good model for predicting aerodynamics on cars. Again, tens of thousands of times faster. It's also now something that is at an industrial scale. So this was done on data that is what the car companies use, the scale of that data. Now we are also doing, as I mentioned, multiple physics and multiple settings, or not just solving one family of partial differential equations, but multiple families. And so there's some nice additional architecture we can do. I won't get into that unless there's some targeted questions. But I want to stop here. I think we're out of time. I'd rather take more questions than cover more material.
Well, thanks for this wonderful talk. It seems like there's actually a lot of questions in the chat, and then someone's raising their hand. So yeah, I think we can officially move to the post-talk group meeting. So you can just stay in this Zoom room, and then hopefully Anima will stick around for a bit to help answer the question. So Anima, I don't know how you want to do this. I can try to pick out questions for you from the chat, or we can just have people kind of pop in and unmute, or what do you prefer?
Yeah, maybe we can first have people unmute, and then I can also just look at the chat. So we'll first give people the ability to just verbally ask questions.
Yeah, and we'll do it. Just go ahead if you feel there's an opening, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Maybe I can ask. Hi, Anima. I'm Shweta from UBC, same time zone. So I have a question. So when you talk about enforcing these domain knowledge and having these physics informed regularization of in your network, when you are using limited data, in a limited data regime, for example. So does it happen ever that even the function that you aim to recover by learning through machine learning algorithms, it has some inductive bias, or it gets like there's some sort of collapse towards what you have already, the domain knowledge that you have already provided? For example, like suppose I want to recover in computer vision, for example, right? So for example, I'm looking for a generative model, which gives me good looking face images, for example, right? But then I have this information on how the textures should be looking like, right? So, but my data does not necessarily say that, right? But then just because I have this world knowledge that I enforce, then does it happen that, you deviate from what you actually want to learn from the data? You become misinformed or something of that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying in terms of what if there is modeling error, right? So there are scenarios where the physics you assume is perfect. So if you're training on data of Navier-Stokes, right? So it's generated from the solver, it's converged, it satisfies the equation, and you're adding the equation laws that's also Navier-Stokes, it's perfectly aligned. So the data and the physics agree with each other. There are many other scenarios where that may not be the case. You may not perfectly know the physics, or more important, in most of the cases, you know the equations, you may not know what are the parameters to put in the equation. What exactly is the Reynolds number here, or what is the material property for heat conduction, as an example. So you know something about the physics, but you're not fully sure what that physics is. So this is where we have a range of options, right? You could say, instead of the full equation, I do some conservation law, right? There's kind of like heat conservation or others that always holds. So in that case, there is still perfect alignment between what the data is saying and the physics laws is saying. And if in the other case where you want to enforce, but you're not sure, you can also try to infer what is the right Reynolds number from the data, right? So you kind of try to, if it's not fully specified equations, you try to find what is the best one. And you come up with the uncertainty. In fact, we have a recent paper where we look at uncertainty quantification via conformal prediction for these neural operators. So you can come up with bounds of uncertainty, and based on that, you can decide how much to weigh the physics laws versus the data laws. And that's the general approach. If you now have errors in your physics laws, you figure out through uncertainty quantification what should be the right weight on that, and then you can still use it.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
And that's where there is the benefit here compared to, say, vision, right? So in vision or language, there's not any law. Of course, if the vision is purely synthetically generated, then right? And that's why the radiance field of the aspects of reflection and others, that's physics. But if it's just general vision, then you don't have laws, and that's why that's not been so successful. But in all of these cases, there is lots of laws of physics that are useful. I think even just yesterday, the AlphaFold 3, if you see, there was the point that, we didn't use equivariance because the optimization, this was good without, right? But there hasn't been enough scrutiny of this set. My guess is, that may kind of come up more. And AlphaFold may be actually okay because it's just structure, right? So you kind of aren't that, even if it's slightly off, maybe you can correct for it. But I do think it matters a lot more in dynamics. So if you're now doing molecular dynamics and you don't use the equivariance, a little bit mistake you make, you keep adding those errors and it just goes off the rails. Same in the sphere example I told you with weather models. If you're now treating it as a rectangle and not as a sphere, errors start building up as you go over time, and then it blows up. So, so I think we need to kind of balance that beta lesson versus when I should add the domain knowledge. And it requires some deeper thinking. It's not always obvious, but there are, I think, general rules of thumb, like I mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that helps.
Sorry, if you don't mind, I just ask my final question, if it's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the background of the work which I do, I'm just working with the multiomics for the cancer, and I have never just worked with I never heard actually of the neural operators. I'm just gonna try it for my model. But the thing which is very important for my work was that because I'm working with the massive data, big data, I have to just move between different modules. Then how is it possible does the big data is a challenging aspect of these neural operators? Or if no, for example, how can I, because the certainty of the inference, which I'm just going to make, is very important, how to quantify the uncertainty, or these were the things which I was thinking over that, because I'm just going to use it for the very first time in my work. Thanks in advance.
So we have a library, so I encourage you to go check it out. If you Google neural operator on GitHub, it's there. So we'll welcome feedback, and it's right, everything is under permissive license. So take a look and let us know. With respect to uncertainty, I mentioned we have a recent paper. If you look up uncertainty quantification, conformal prediction, and neural operators, you will see what we are proposing there. And it's quite natural in terms of coming up with these guaranteed upper and lower bounds, right? So the uncertainty region for these models. And I think that's useful in a number of scenarios. So in terms of data and other aspects, as you saw, there isn't that much difference from other standards, say graph neural net, if you're using that, or the Fourier-based model, you can think of it as a special form of attention, right? So similar things hold for kind of getting these models to be trained.
Awesome. I'm just going to, by all means, I'm going to look into the paper. Thanks, Amelia, for the talk today. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. First of all, thank you, Professor Anandkumar, for that lovely talk. A huge fan of your research, and I would also like to thank the Vector Institute to allow outsiders from Canada to also visit. I'm in the University of Virginia right now. But that being said, I want to keep it crisp and concise. Hopefully, my questions will be directed. My first question was, what inspired your group to choose the Fourier basis as a Fourier neural operator, considering you just mentioned there are so many other orthogonal bases that exist? So that's my first question. And I can maybe ask the others too, but however you would like.
I mean, that came from our collaborators, right? So we started working on this problem with Andrew Stewart in applied math, Kaushik Bhattacharya, material science, with the deep knowledge of PDEs. And so the first question was, we have this pseudospectral solver, right? And how do we take the knowledge from that and turn this also into a data-driven model? So, and this aspect that we preserve the good properties of the traditional solvers, but add more expressivity. And so Fourier is natural. Sure, there are other bases, and there are also other works looking at other bases. I would say, if you just see historically, FFT is the most commonly used transform. And the reason is it's fast, right? So the quasi-linear time is great, but also the aspect that it captures these kind of global information, especially like if you look at fluid dynamics as an example, the Fourier, the frequency domain interactions, it's also like a nice inductive bias. So there's lots of reasons that is good. But also, just to add, in cases where this Fourier neural operator may not be enough because it kind of like smooths out things, this Fourier transform tends to have that as an inductive bias. You can kind of add like other layers of the input and output to capture local information like graph. We've also done like these discrete continuous convolutions and other, such local operators. In fact, that paper is just accepted to ICML. I encourage you to check that. And so now we can build these like composition of architectures that capture both local and global information efficiently. And so we're kind of getting to a world where you have this zoo of architecture similar to what you had in standard neural nets. And there's clear where, in what regimes, what would be effective. Of course, in the extreme regime where you have tons of data, you could do a full transformer or a full-on quadratic attention-based neural operator, where you not only have attention at a fixed resolution, you have attention at any resolution, right? So in principle, you can imagine that architecture, but we are just not in the regime that we see with the language of vision. And that, I think, is the reason, that those architectures haven't yet caught up.
Okay, no, thanks, Professor. I think it captures two of my questions already. The last thing that I had was, this is more philosophical. Do you see any synergy between the Fourier neural operator and, like you just mentioned, there are zoos of architectures out there, and the liquid time constant neural networks or the residual ODE solving neural networks? I was just wondering if you see a synergy between all of them as a single architecture which can benefit from each other.
Yeah, so these liquid and all of this, what you mentioned is a neural ODE, right? So at the core, what it has is still an ODE solver, which is a traditional solver within that architecture. So you can think of that as a special case of neural operator, because even traditional solvers are part of this, right? So in that broad class, that's well and good. And it depends. In some regimes, maybe, right, still keeping a traditional ODE solver could be helpful if you want to do very, very long trajectories and you don't want to train for, that long. These solvers could kind of, right, work with more limited data. But in our kind of perspective, what we found is in so many cases, on the other hand, if you have reasonable amount of data, right? So it's better to kind of let kind of this, again, not the full bidder lesson, but the bidder lesson of more end-to-end learning. So the more parts you put where it's not learned and it's like a black box, and you're trying to interact like these, during backprop with all of this, it's a mess, right? It doesn't really learn well. So once you kind of like put these roadblocks to learning in an architecture, it doesn't kind of work out that well. And so in regimes where there is sufficient data, I would like, put forth the aspect of trying to make all the components fairly learnable and flexible.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Thank you.
I think there's one more hand up.
Hi, thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I just have I'm intuitionally, so the neural operator would be better or has a better advantage learning chaotic system. Is that right? Thanks.
Yes, so I didn't cover the chaotic systems aspect here. We have papers, in the past. There's also some recent work. So what makes the chaotic system different, right? So there is the aspect of, let's take the example of the weather model. So if you go from weather prediction 1 to 2 weeks, it's still in the predictable range, meaning you can, with a fair bit of accuracy and confidence, you can say what's going to happen. But now if you ask for prediction a month later, right, there's no confidence. You don't know exactly what the trajectory will happen. This is what we call a chaotic system, where just tiny, small changes can change the trajectory by a lot in the future. So if you run it long enough, there is divergence of trajectory. It's also what people call the butterfly effect, right? So the butterfly flutters and rainstorm comes, kind of like a, right, small, just to kind of, right, emphasize the aspect, small changes can have a big change in outcome. So given that we now go to an unpredictable regime in terms of exact trajectory prediction, what else can we do? It turns out many of these systems have attractors. So even though there is divergence based on perturbations, there is still some like statistical bounds, you can say, right? You can talk about average properties. You can say, what is the characterization of this set of trajectories? What is the measure of that? What we call an invariant measure. And these are the aspects we can characterize. And we've done that in the paper on learning chaotic systems using these neural operators. So the philosophy is, if you're going into this chaotic regime, you should not try to predict in this long term, right? If you try to predict this whole trajectory and use that as a loss function, it just blows up because it's not predictable anymore. Instead, you learn only short-term predictions. You learn the model in terms of how it is behaving in the short term. And then at test time, you just roll out the model for longer and look at its kind of average properties. If you also do an ensemble of initial conditions and come up with average answers. And this is what also people do for climate models, right? So they come up with a range of initial conditions and look at ensembles, run it out for a long time, come up with average statistics for climate. But yeah, you can now use neural operators to also learn the simulation of chaotic systems, but it's a little more indirect because you just first learn for short-term characteristics and then ensure there is stability in rolling out long-term. So in the case of the weather, this is where having like the sphere and other kind of spherical geometry adds that nice stability properties. If that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
So I know some of the people who asked questions in the chat unmuted and asked questions. So I haven't actually kept track of which ones have already been asked. Maybe I'll just ask if anyone has additional questions that they put in the chat. I just saw one pop up. If you're able to unmute instead, you can go ahead and do that. But otherwise, I'll try to pick out one or two from the chat that I don't believe have been asked and ask those. So there was just a question asking if you could contrast the motivation for neural operators compared to like polynomial approximation functions in traditional neural networks. That question might need some clarification, but if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to share.
Yeah. I mean, I think the polynomial approximation, maybe they're mentioning, like, for instance, there's multi-linear operators. That was one of the recent papers that was shown that, you can learn well with this kind of multilinear or a tensor basis, right? And learn many kind of domains very well. So I don't know if that is the aspect. But first of all, anything that's done in a traditional neural network, by definition, the mapping of the input and output, those input and outputs are assumed to be of fixed dimension, right? And here the input and output are functions themselves. So you can extend those also to be in the function space, but by itself, it's not comparable. Yes, I'm not sure if there was anything.
Thanks. Yeah, there also were a couple of people just asking for your general comments on the recently proposed Kolmogorov-Arnold networks, which are, so feel free to just spitball.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And some of that is like Caltech collaborators and students who I think are excellent. So, it kind of philosophically makes sense to think about not just linear matrix multiplication, right, as the building block for standard neural networks, but like splines and others as building blocks. And this goes back to kind of the traditional approximation of using like basis like splines to come up with function approximation. But of course, now the difference is, instead of a fixed basis, you can learn the composition of these bases. So it's now adaptive basis rather than fixed basis in the parlance of those, right, function approximation. So you're kind of like getting that benefit of, if the data looks like, it can be represented well in the basis of splines and its compositions, you have a better, more compact network. But I do also agree, I think there were also online comments on this, like, but we finally have to run this on existing hardware, right? And existing hardware is highly optimized for matrix multiplication. And so I think it's not clear how you would like kind of re-architect everything to do this CAN. So, but as with neural operator, that's not an issue. You can take all existing neural networks, turn them into neural operators, right? Have the adaptability to multiple resolutions. So they're not directly comparable. You can do the CAN also in a neural operator architecture by replacing matrix multiplication with splines. So in that sense, they're complementary. But yeah, broadly, my opinion about CAN is interesting idea, but I'm not sure how you would scale that up with existing hardware.
Cool. Maybe one last question from the chat, and then if anyone else wants to unmute and ask anything before we close up, feel free to do so. But there was just another question that popped up with asking if you can comment on whether neural operators, and what, I'll expand their question. In what cases do you think neural operators could handle real-time applications, and what kind of hardware would be needed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these models can be quite compact and efficient. In fact, we are looking at both using this for turbulence prediction on drones. We're also, right, like the nuclear fusion example I mentioned, now that we have this kind of predictor, how do we take it to do it on real time and actually predict disruption? So in a number of cases, these models are quite small and compact and can be put on the edge. And this is also the massive difference, right? If you try to take a traditional solver and do real time, it almost is never possible. And here we can do that, and that's a big deal.
Very cool. If anyone else wants to chime in with another question now, feel free to do so, but otherwise, there, great, got another one. Bye, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. I don't know if you have applied this or considered this method, the neural operators, for the low data regime for few shot learning or zero shot learning. And I'm specifically thinking about drug discovery campaigns where you start from very little, if any, data relevant to the domain that you're applying to. Given that you have two sources of data, one coming from conventional computational science, computational physics or chemistry or similar areas, and then you have the other one coming from data. Is it possible, or have you tried to add data by titration and ramp it up and decide on the fly how much data you need to achieve a certain level of accuracy?
Right. So, I mean, it's very much amenable to combining this kind of synthetic or simulation data with observational or experimental data, right? So in a way, the weather model is an example of that because, historically, so we are currently not directly training on observations or satellite data, but it's already assimilated with physics models. So there is still the knowledge of physics baked in, but that aspect has kind of happened before this neural operator model. But lately, there are all kinds of investigations in terms of doing that in a more online fashion. So as you're getting new data, how do you update it? So we've been doing like few shot learning in other scenarios like this, kind of extending single physics to multiphysics. The last slide I have up here, I didn't go into details. So you can take like kind of these aspects that you've learned a single physics well, like fluid dynamics. Now, what if you had a way within the fluid, right? That's new physics. But instead of training from scratch, it's, there's already some properties of fluid is already learned by the model. And now you can see how that changes and do it with few samples.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. Within that regime, would you alter the relative weight given to the loss function related to data compared to one that fits from the computational data?
Yeah, so it depends, right? So again, if there's only very limited experimental data, you do want to kind of hone in on that. But if it's only too little, you may not learn. So it really depends.
Thank you very much.
Great. Well, I think with that, we can probably thank Anima again for this wonderful talk and for sticking around and answering a bunch of extra questions. Obviously, lots of interest in this because it's super interesting stuff. So yeah, thanks again, and look forward to seeing you around somewhere.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. And it was great to do this virtually. I think the benefit of virtual talk is you also see people from everywhere. So
That's right.
it's great to see really good participation and engagement. And yeah, check out the library, check out the papers, and again, reach out to us any questions, any thoughts you have. Yeah.
Right. Thanks a lot. See you, everyone.
Thank
you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.